Hello, everyone. Hello, there we go. All right. Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the ItCast Real Talk. I am your host, Nika Cherrelles. The ItCast is our community outreach podcast that aims to increase diversity in conversations on health and sexuality. Through this work, we are creating a world where all people feel loved, honored, and respected. Please visit us on Patreon to support the ItCast and learn more about our work at theitcast.com. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel and share with your community. So this week's episode is Real Talk on Historic Trauma Part 2. And as a trigger warning, this episode contains content on race, racial discrimination, and racially related language. Please be mindful and take care of yourselves as you listen to this episode. And we would love to have your comments and feedback on more topics you want to hear. This episode, we're actually talking about systemic, the conversations around systemic racism and what that brings up in the world today. So we're going to be looking at the government, we're going to be looking at institutionalized racism and the things that have consistently impacted us. And in the booth, we have with us today, Maggie Rast. Go ahead and join us. Hello, Maggie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Go ahead.
Just a little bit about me. My conversations today are world peace through awesome sex and having freedom and passion and creating your life. And I'm 63-year-old white female, born on the East Coast of the United States, heterosexual. Does that answer? There you go. That's who I am.
Perfect. And next we have Inez Teemer. Inez, please join us.
Hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Yes, hi. My name is Inez and I'm from Chicago. And basically I am into everything wellness, feminine wellness. I've also dabbled in now into the men wellness. And this is very important topic to talk about because it affects us even on a physical level and how this racism can really affect us as physically and how diseases can come about it, mental illness can come about it. So that's what I'm here for. That's my mission.
Thank you. Warren Varney is also in the booth. Hi, Warren.
Hi. I have the distinct privilege of being the minority, which is rare for me because as an old white man, I am the scourge of the majority causing most of these problems. But I'm a 77-year-old white man, been married 57 years, got 2 kids, 3 grandchildren, live in Kansas City, Missouri. I have a master's of divinity degree. I can say that I serve out my ministry, but not in a church. Spent nearly the last 40 years as a financial advisor. Spent most of my life being an activist in civil rights and anti-war work, and trying to make this planet work.
Thank you. Thank you. We also have Kim Harrington. Got a beautifully large panel today. Kim, go ahead and welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Kim, I'm 53, I'm obviously white. I raised my kids as a single mom, grew up in a very mixed culture in New Orleans, and I'm a metaphysical practitioner. And my goal is to take a holistic, natural approach to kind of unravel and dismantle what we've been taught or brainwashed or, over the years, and kind of free your mind and, everybody get along and just see people for who they are. We're all humans, and just have that respect. And I thank you, Nika, for giving us the platform to have the conversation, because I believe that's where it starts.
Thank you. Absolutely. All right, next we have Dr. Rita Fierro. Dr. Rita, please join us in the conversation. Hi.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you all. I'm Dr. Rita Fierro, as you said, Nika, and I'm a sociologist. I also have a PhD in African American Studies, and I'm white. I'm raised white. I'm Italian American. I spent a good amount of years in Italy, and I'm actually bicultural and bilingual. And my passion around I've been studying systemic racism for 27 years, I think we're at, more or less in terms of count. And I've been observing across these years how the system morphs. Like, how does it change without changing, right? Like, how does it adapt without actually changing? And that's kind of been my specialty in my studies over the years. And what I'm really passionate about is the ways in which white people have oppressed ourselves and our hearts to be able to support the system. So how have we been trained to uphold what is, and how have we wounded ourselves and each other and our humanity to uphold racism at all costs in the current power structure? As a person who focuses a lot on trauma transformation and healing, that's what I'm passionate about.
Thank you. And thank you for your work. I'm really excited about this conversation. Lastly, and newly in the booth with us for this conversation, very excited to have Ellen Morrison join us for part 2. Hi, Ellen. Please tell everyone a little about yourself.
Well, it's certainly good to be here. And I appreciate being part of this circle, the virtual circle. So I am calling in from the unceded territory of the Ohlone, also known as Berkeley, California. I am 49 years old, and I'm on a journey of trauma, personal and systemic transformation of trauma. I work as a psychotherapist and also a facilitator in the diversity, equity, and inclusion world. And, I identify as white. My ethnic heritage is Swedish and Scottish. And I'm just looking forward to the conversation, the dialogue today.
Beautiful. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to dive in, and hello to everyone out there viewing and watching. Please post your questions and comments in the chat. I see my brother is with us, so hello to you. And also, so let's go ahead and dive in. Ellen, the first question that I want us to look at today is what trauma actually is, since we're talking about healing trauma and what that looks like. Let's get a feel for like, what's the context of this?
Sure. There's many ways to talk about trauma, and one of the ways, I come from this lens as also an activist. And I want to say that it's important to look at the trauma through both a social and a physiological lens. And one of the ways that coming out of the book, Politics of Trauma, they talk about trauma being a threat to our safety, belonging, and dignity, right? And that we certainly have an autonomic response when we're threatened, when our safety, belonging, and dignity are threatened. And there's also quite a bit of social context. I'm also appreciative of the way that Resmaa Menakem talks about trauma, that we can't decontextualize trauma, otherwise it becomes, we individualize it. So trauma decontextualized in a family, right, becomes family traits, right? Really important for us to be looking at it in context. Trauma decontextualized individually becomes individual traits, right? Something that decontextualized means that there's something wrong with us versus maybe what happened, right? So talking about the importance of looking at not what's wrong, but what happened. Trauma decontextualized in a culture becomes, of a people, becomes, somehow individualized as well. So
Right.
thank you for asking the question. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
That really opened up a lot for me in terms of what trauma actually is, and that safety and that belonging being threatened. And I even hear on the individual level, it's easy to not pay attention to or resolve or think that the threat is that important. And it actually, it comes from a larger system. So that's
right.
powerful.
That's right. And speaking of power, right, it's also, it's when our brain perceives an experience of powerlessness, so, that intersects with the experience of racism or other forms of oppression.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to comment just on trauma in general before we move on?
I'd just like to add that trauma in part is the body's response to an overload in the system, like in our body systems. So it's basically like an experience of pain that's too much. And so then the body has to find a way to cope. And so the ways we generally talk about are fight, flight, or freeze. But the book that Ellen was referring to, Politics of Trauma, also talks about appeasing as a trauma response. So like people pleasing is often a trauma response. And there's one more, but there's also, many people also talk about tending and mending as in particular a female response to trauma, right? Trying to take care of everybody else and going into hyperactivity in some way as a way to kind of shut down, like cope with the feeling of overwhelm, of lack of safety or too much pain or whatever else it is. So, and so the trauma gets stored in the mind and in the body, right? And these are the studies that we know that are fairly recent, like we're talking about maybe the last, I'm not certain, Ellen, you may be able to say this more than I, but I think we're talking about at least at most last 10, 15 years of studies, because now we have MRIs and we can actually look at what's happening in the brain, while for hundreds of years, humans were hypothesizing what was happening in the brain, but didn't actually have ways to observe it. And so what we know is that trauma is stored in both the brain and the body. And that's important because it means that talking it out doesn't always work. But what we have to do is create places of safety where we can release it both from the mind and from the body.
Yeah.
This is, man, this is amazing for me, because what I'm hearing is threat, powerlessness, overload, but it's perceived. And what showed up really for me was how often we get judgmental about somebody else when we hear somebody going on about what's going on in their lives, and we make a judgment that it's not that. It's perceived that it doesn't, and we make a judgment that that's not real, so we discount it. So we go, oh, that's BS. You're just making that up. Well, whether they are or they aren't, it doesn't matter. That's their experience. And as long as that's their experience, it's real for them. And by discounting it, we've just loaded it up some more. We've just created a divide. We've just discounted them. And it comes right back to the racism in all its forms. We've demeaned. We've done everything we're talking about here. We've just said, you're worthless. We completely wiped them out. So that's amazing. That's just like, wow, there it is, the nut right there, the whole nutshell right there.
Yeah. Wow.
And I can even see where, because I've done energy work and have had energy work done, where trauma is stored in the body. And as a practitioner, you can even feel it on a person, and they can feel it on me, that, okay, I can feel that there's trauma there. And they know something had occurred there, whether it was physical, whether it was emotional. And when that happened, it pulled up some things. So when I was able to do energy work, even after they told me on myself, I had to send it to the past where it occurred. And then I could feel where it was lifted when that happened. So yes, it does. It's like it sticks in the body for some reason. And some people actually think, oh, my shoulder hurts, or this happened, which the other day, my right side was hurting. And it was exactly the same place I was in a car accident in, and I got hit directly at that spot. So when I had energy work done, it was gone.
Mm.
It was gone.
Mm.
Yeah, I like what you said, Inez, because we're both on this vibe on the same stuff with the energy work. And the way to describe it is the trauma and the stress. Well, if you don't deal with it and let it go, it can manifest anywhere in your body. So there's Reiki healers, there's, different therapies, there's different things that can clear out the blockages. So I call them it's a manifestation that is in your body. So if you're feeling sick, or this conversation may trigger somebody because it's a reminder of what happened to them when they were younger or something like that. It just means that it's unresolved. And then once you work through it and that blockage is cleared and that energy can be released, it's a complete healing, like body, mind, and soul.
Yeah.
Because the energy can flow.
Yeah, it can
correctly.
flow. Right.
Beautiful. Beautiful. So let's bring this. I love the conversation because I think about how I get triggered when people discount something I've gone through, and it re-traumatizes and it brings things back up. And I love the context that we are really just now getting into the conversation around trauma, like physiologically speaking, what it does to the body. So I'd like to pull this conversation into the now. I know last time we talked about slavery, and I think we were just getting to like police brutality and what's going on there, and how trauma shows up. So can we talk about some of the areas where systemic racism is and how it's traumatizing? And whoever would like to jump in.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you're wanting to talk about, but I'm here in Austin, and we have a gentleman. His name is Rodney Reed, and he's been incarcerated and he's on death row for 20 years. And they just had another trial because they're pulling out more witnesses and more evidence, and he's probably going to be released. But it's so disheartening to me that it's been this long. I mean, every life is valuable. And, there's more Black men incarcerated now than there were in slavery enslaved. Mm-hmm. So that really bothers me. I feel it's another form of control. It's another form of, I don't know what.
Yes. Let's talk about the prison industrial complex and how slavery persists. Dr. Rita, I know you had some stuff that you shared about that. Would you like to jump in here?
Sure. I'd like to take a step back and then a step forward. So one of the things that I highlight in my work is that all systems have a common denominator, which is disproportionality. So disproportionality is often used by academics to describe the fact that folks of color are more represented in any negative result you can think of in the United States than they are in the general US population. So children of color are more likely to die of child mortality, are more likely to be placed in foster care for longer periods of time, are more likely to be end up in the juvenile justice system after they've been in foster care, are more likely to be suspended, are more likely to be diagnosed with a mental illness, are more likely. So it's just like whatever aspect of human life we look at, folks of color are overrepresented on any kind of negative measure. With like one small exception, which is Latinos in food, right? So Latinos have such a strong food culture that they tend to have kind of lower rates of high blood pressure and so on and so forth. But to the acceptance of the resilience of kind of Latino culture and food and how that impacts Latino health, overall, throughout the United States, you'll see that African Americans tend to be overrepresented at the highest rate, and then kind of Latinos somewhere in the middle. And then white folk have the higher results. And so I think what that does is it hints to what I call a common recipe. Like there's something that all systems have in common. And sometimes we say we don't know what that it is, but we do know what it is, right? It's systemic oppression, it's white supremacy. And so to the point about the prison industrial complex, a lot of people know about Michelle Alexander's work. And what she highlights is that historically, the moment in which enslavement ended, the 13th Amendment was passed, and the 13th Amendment didn't outlaw slavery. It outlawed slavery except for people who had been convicted of committing a crime. Mm-hmm. So in effect, at the end of slavery, we already see the loophole for how to keep slavery. And this is one of the examples that I would put of how our system adapts without changing, mm-hmm. which is something I was mentioning before. And then the other thing I'd like to say quickly, and then kind of step back to give my colleagues some time here, is that I have a book coming out in, sometime between October and January, not sure exactly. But what I do is look back in time at where the seeds of our systems were planted. And one of the things that I noticed is that this relationship between the criminal justice system and the economy is actually built into the backbone of America. Mm. And the first legislation that it shows up in is actually from Queen Isabella, who was taught in a letter with Christopher Columbus, says that he cannot withhold food from settlers unless they were convicted of as a crime. So there's this backbone of connecting criminal justice, livelihood, and the economy happens very, very early on in our system. And I would assert that's why it's so hard to win, because it's actually built into the fabric of our nation more than we like.
In fact, in the last 48 hours, for the first time in the history of this country, death rates have gone down. Sorry, excuse me, not death rates. Life expectancy has gone down. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but for Caucasians, it's gone down, I think, 1.2 years. And for Blacks and Latinos, it's gone down almost 3 years. I mean, what better definition of systemic racism do you need?
Right.
Well,
I'm
sorry, Dr. Rita, I have a question for you, because I've also been following another study, and like the suburbs versus the urban areas. The suburbs have better schools, they have better medical access, they have everything, as opposed to the urban areas. And so is that another form of systemic racism that was planned? Because that always seems to be an issue. They don't get the medical care they need. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yes. So the American city, and it's kind of interesting if you look at how other cities work, but in the United States, the whole politics of the city is that it's built by some concentric circles. And as soon as folks of color start moving into a neighborhood, white folks leave. And because folks of color tend to be poor, not all, of course, but the folks of color who live in the city tend to be poorer, they don't have cars. Or they have less transportation or less access to their own independent transportation. And since we have a pure capitalist system, in the presence of people who may not have a car and can't go to the can't compete, go have the option of 5 different supermarkets, if they all have only one supermarket, then that supermarket can have lower quality food at a higher price. Mm-hmm. Because people cannot deal with competition. And so that's for everything else. The reason why everything's better in the suburbs is because everyone has more money and access to cars. And so the competition is fierce. And so they have to treat you superbly for you to go one place versus another, because you have a higher level of choice.
Well, can I make a comment? Because I live in the city and it is segregated. And the thing is, some neighborhoods, of course, they say are better than the others. But in the African-American neighborhoods, the food, even the clothes, the stores, all the economic systems is a lot different than it is in other neighborhoods, and including education. And then after a while, then people in the community, like kids or even teenagers or some adults, feel like, okay, then I got to take it because it's not given to us. Then they get arrested for that, because we don't have the system set up equally. So then when these people go to jail, they think this is the correct way to be. This is the correct, because of the racism, because how one neighborhood is different from the other neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I've seen this all my life here. Not people here in here think, oh, people in the suburbs don't have much, even though they got great stores and everything like that. Don't get me wrong. But it's segregated in the metropolitan cities. And these people, and I know some, they thought that was the way of life. They would take from the people who had it. I mean, there were drugs that were brought into that particular community, and the people in the community thought that was right. And then they sent them right to jail. Mm-hmm. They sent them right.
And to put a little context in here, I've heard a lot of people, because it's hip and fashionable, use terms like ghetto and hood and things like that. And you really have to understand the conversation of redlining. Mm. And the places were created based on economic and race-based ways in which you are keeping a population of people together and away from another population. So this is segregation. These are the roots of it. And a ghetto, like literally that's what it means. It's a segregated, separated area where people of a specific economic class or racial background are dictated to live.
You know, in 1974, we decided to buy a home, and it's the home I still live in. And it's a 3-bedroom ranch style home. The lot's 75 feet by 170 feet. So it was reasonably nice house, and it's in a small subdivision of 57 homes. And we had a list of things we wanted. One of them was we wanted to live in an integrated neighborhood. And then we're in Kansas City, Missouri. And I quote you, when we started going to realtors, they said, and this is a quote, "We don't know where they live," unquote. We don't know where they live. Really? Not long after we moved in, and out of the 56, 57 homes, about a third of them were Black owned. And you could tell which ones were black owned because they were by far the best kept. Literally, shortly thereafter, realtors were going through the neighborhood. And when they got to knocking doors, when they got to a black neighborhood, they were talking about homes that were going up for sale. And did they know anybody who wanted to buy a home? Literally, word for word. And they get to a white neighborhood, they were talking about how quickly the neighborhood was transforming and the house values were going down. And did you want to sell? And there was it was like, and a black neighbor and a white neighbor got together and had a neighborhood meeting. And they switched that out so that the white neighbor would say, yes, I do, and send them to a black neighbor to flip the game on them. And a black neighbor would say, no, but my neighbor down the street wants to sell, and send them to a black neighbor just to stop the racial steering. But that happened in 1974. So guess what's happening this year? The same damn thing. We're getting postcards, emails, the same damn thing's happening this year.
I like what you said, Warren. I mean, I'm also a realtor, and we can lose our license for doing that. So we can't do redlining. We can't do steering. We can't be racist, and we definitely cannot do blockbusting.
Neither can black people, but guess what's going on?
Yeah. I mean, and blockbusting is another thing. It's persuading people, to move. And it's so shocking to me that this is still going on. But back in the 70s, it was really prevalent because if one black family moved in, all the white people would think that their property values are going to drop and they would sell their house. It was terrible.
We went around and thanked them for leaving.
Yeah.
I'm serious.
Yeah. Yeah.
We didn't know this about you, but we're glad you're gone. And by the way, going to Blue Springs, it's already 50%, 20%, 30% black. Guess what you're going to find when you get there? You lost your ass, and you're going to find the same neighbors.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
crazy.
Bye, baby.
I wanted to thread something forward that Inez you brought up, which is the school to prison pipeline, and the realities of that the number of beds that prisons actually plan for are based on literacy rates in elementary schools.
Huh.
Wow. Thank you for that. Ellen, something else that came up earlier, and I'd love to circle back around to is the medical industry. And looking at like life expectancy rates and how the medical industry plays into systemic racism there. Can you speak to that?
I don't know if I can speak so much to medical, but maybe mental health. But yes, I can certainly.
Either one.
Well, I was just with my wife's family a few months ago, and or last month actually, and her brother-in-law had this T-shirt on that said, "Racism is the worst form of mental illness," and is a form of mental illness, right? And so I just want to note that in terms of our mental health system, there's certainly accessibility issues. There's certainly issues around disproportionality of people not getting the care that they deserve and they need. And there's certainly I've worked in community mental health for the majority of my career, and worked with people, because we can't leave out sort of the context of poverty as also a factor here in disproportionality and accessibility, and in the context, and when we talk about trauma, and I think that this is where our system is. Where the mental health system specifically can be very faulty because we individualize the problem rather than contextualize it. I know training has definitely shifted and changed, But a lot of the training that I had to get was outside the institution, right? Around being a provider. So, and it was a very intentional sort of educational pathway for me, right? To seek out mentors and information about how to work with, cross culturally and work within the context of racism, right? Versus individualize. One of our more, when we sort of harken back to the context of slavery and think about the drapetomania being the mental illness that was associated with slaves for running away, right? It's of course the symptoms that we see, the behaviors that are relevant and prevalent in people that experience racism are reasonable responses to what's happening. They're not ill, they're not sick, there's not something wrong with them. It's very much needs to be contextualized, the work. So I don't know if you want to say more about that, but
thank you for that. There's two things that brought up for me. One of the comments we had earlier talks about how trauma impacts DNA and how that goes on for up to 5 generations.
That's right.
Yeah, and so that's something that's super powerful to like put some context on as well. And then, the mental health arena is the medical industry, and everything that you said crosses over. So, thank you for providing that space.
Absolutely.
I can
I think
speak.
Rita was, okay.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I can speak from the wellness industry because the thing is, and I have a story, real quick story, is I had just drank some coffee, like I'm doing now, and I went and had a blood pressure tested, and they told me my blood pressure was high. I was like, really? So I find that odd. It was 122/74. And I was like, that's not high. But they didn't know who they was talking to because I had the training in the wellness field. And I already know they lowered the numbers so that you can get put back on medication. You can be put on medication. So I said, well, my blood pressure is high. I know what to do to bring it down, but that's not high. They said, well, you must have ate at a restaurant or something. I said, in the last week? No. Well, it could be some stressful things you're going through. No. They were trying to give me all kind of excuses. And then I told them who I am and what I do. They were like, really? And then I said, you know what? If it were high, I know to meditate. I know to what foods to eat. I know how to detox. I know how to juice. And the nurse who was there was writing it down. I'm like, oh my God. Like, maybe I need to try this. And then the doctor that was there said, oh, we need you to work for us. I said, do you really want me to work for you? So I could tell the people how to lower their pressure, how to lower their sugar or whatever, because I could do it if you want me to. But you're not putting me on the medication, because they told a woman, and before me, a Caucasian woman, oh, your blood pressure is high, but we know what to do to help you, because it's only temporary. But then you telling me that my blood pressure was high and I had to be on medication for the rest of my life.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Dr. Rita, were you going to share something earlier?
No, not right now.
Sorry, got that. Yeah.
You know, I do have a suggestion. I appreciate Inez's story. That's just horrible. But if anybody has Amazon Prime, I just watched, the name of the documentary is The Uncomfortable Truth. And they interview a white guy who has a past with slavery, and they interview a black guy. And it is so informative. It's so good. It's both perspectives, and it's very educational. And I think just from what I'm learning about all of this, when I go to the grocery store, when I go out, I respond differently because, you know, some people of color will react negative to me. And I know because I represent a negative thing that has happened for 400 years, you know, the systemic racism. So I don't take it personal. So if there's anything that I want the white folks to understand is that we need to take a step back, not be so combative, and be compassionate and empathetic and understand that and walk away. Like just because they're still going through the healing process and trying to figure things out. And I just, on behalf of all white people, I apologize deeply. I think it's horrific what was done. And there's, you know, y'all talked about trauma. It lasts in the DNA for generations. It's like, I look at it like a embroidered quilt. It's just woven in to your DNA, and it's passed on and it's passed on. So just the only thing that I can think that I can do is when I come into these situations, I diffuse it or I walk away and I don't take it personal, and I understand, because if that was me, I would be incarcerated right now. If I had to have, you know, dark colored skin and, you know, be judged and abused and everything else, I wouldn't react very well. So yeah.
Hey, we're not that far from slavery, because I'm like the third or fourth generation from slavery when I had my DNA test done. So yeah, I mean, it's still in us. It's still in our DNA. That's why movement is so important to do, because we can bring all that up. Yeah. We can, and sometimes we don't know why we act that way, and it's because of the trauma from past generations.
I'm not a DNA scientist, so I may be dead wrong, but I don't believe it's in our DNA. I believe it's in our culture. And it's so ingrained in our culture, it may feel like it's in our DNA, but saying it's in our DNA is an excuse not to be responsible. I think it's so deeply ingrained in our culture that we don't see the distinction. It's a common habit. It's been in our family lines for a very, very long time. White people aren't the only people that are racist by any means. It's in our religious institutions. It's in our political institutions. It seems to be a relatively common trait in power structures of all kinds all the time. I don't want to blame it on DNA. I don't think there's any evidence to support that whatsoever.
Well, Warren, what I mean about that is that it's the trauma, if it's not healed, it's passed down from generation to generation. Mm-hmm. And it affects the children, the grandchildren, everyone. I mean, and if we don't cleanse that energy and do the wellness and the holistic healing, like Inez was saying, and release those blockages and release that trauma, it's still carried down. So whether you call it DNA, whether you call it trauma, whether you call it generational, whether you call it systemic, I've watched this happen over and over and over again. I talk to people that are struggling with this on a weekly basis.
I get it. That old story about the guy that his wife sends him out to get a ham, and he goes out to the store to get the ham, and he comes back with a ham, and the wife says, "You didn't cut the end of the ham off." And he says, "Yeah, I know I'm supposed to cut the end of the ham off, but I got to thinking, why?" She said, "We always cut the end of the ham off." And I'll cut the short story short. He says, my mom cut the end of the ham off, grandma cut the end of the ham off. Someone find out why. So he calls mom, and she's why. He says, what's wrong with you? You always cut the end of the ham off. Why? We always did. So he calls grandma, and she says, well, because the pan was too short. I mean, there's these cultural things that take on the impact of DNA, and so it's just a story.
Well, I don't think
Well, it's
people are
both.
really blaming the DNA, but it is in the DNA because the culture in here is different from the African American culture is different here as opposed to over in Africa, as opposed to possibly even Puerto Rico and things like that. But here in the United States, we're considered the lost tribe. So yes, it is a cultural thing. It is cultural, but nobody is blaming it on the DNA. And just like Kim was saying, it is passed down from generation to generation because it was told to me that, I mean, the way parents beat their kids, the African Americans, it's the same way the slave owners used to beat the slaves. So it is definitely passed down because if people start getting into past life regression, you really start seeing a lot and releasing a lot, because that's another modality. And the thing is, I've been through some of these type of modalities, and I came up with, oh my God, I didn't know I did that. Or past lives, like, oh my God, I didn't know this. Wow.
Yeah.
It freaked me out. So yeah, I mean, it, like she said, it you could call it whatever you want. It is what it is.
So
you all are having the Die Hard. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like we are in agreement, though, that the past does impact the present, whether it's culturally or genetically based, and that there's an echo to it. I wanted to, Ellen, actually, I wanted to see if you wanted to pitch in on the topic, or Dr. Rita, Maggie, any of you, just to finish us out. Go ahead.
Well, I would love to, because there's something about normalizing things and just being numb to things that come through the generations. And you're taught by your parents who were taught by their grandparents. So there's a whole historical continuation that then you get numb to, because that's just the way it is, because that's how you were raised. For instance, my family, there was not good lines of communication. No one ever talked directly about anything. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I worked on those sets of communication. And I saw, like in my family, like, no, that wasn't normal. I mean, that wasn't effective. It was normal for me. That was the normalness for kind of like picking up on physical cues, because no one would say anything. And then I got like what I thought was going on when I was like magically reading someone's physical cues and smiles or twitches of the faces. And when I started to ask them how they felt at that point, it was totally different from what my magical thinking thought was happening. So I really had to start disconnecting, like, what I grew up as a survival thing to know if someone was mad, if someone was happy, so I could modify my behavior. I had to decouple that because it was so normal in the way I was raised, and we kind of numb out on things like that. Someone was saying, like, how could you go to church back during slavery, go back to church and pray to God and all the goodness, and then go out and watch a lynching and have a picnic with your family? I mean, there's a disconnect there that somehow you have to numb parts of your humanity out to be able to do that. So that's what it's a numbness. And I think today in this conversation, like, parts of me are waking up. So thank you. Thank you for this.
Yeah.
This.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Ellen?
Oh, we're just having the tried and true conversation about nature versus nurture, right? And both are true. Just want to say that, right? And what the name of this DNA conversation we're having is called epigenetics. So there's a name for it. And, you know, I'm appreciative of Maggie, you're talking about, you know, the white people's trauma, right? And our legacy of dehumanization, the thawing of that permission, and that without consciousness about it, without understanding of our history, we will continue to perpetuate it. So I appreciate you bringing that into the conversation.
Yes.
So I wanted to add like a little bit, this is a little the sociologist in me, wanting to like talk about how everything we're saying is related. So when we talk about DNA or culture or a lack of compassion, or there was another that we had mentioned, like, and you know, at some point it sounded like we were saying, well, you know, whether you call it this or you call it this, they're all racism. And I just want to bring out in a different way. So in sociology, what we talk about is dimensions of a concept. So it's sort of like racism is a box. And then each of these dimensions we're talking are one side. Together, they make the thing. So lack of compassion, to your point, Ellen, is how, and Maggie's point, lack of compassion and numbness, the way Maggie was saying, is the way whites have been trained to uphold the system. Part of that is culture. The fact that a white person or a white family may move out because a Black family moved into their neighborhood, that's cultural. But the piece around epigenetics, it's like, what have we been passed down that has us go to that numbness or that defensiveness? So perhaps the fact that white folks in a room of all people of color feel uncomfortable and their body gets tense because we've been trained to believe that actually we were the aggressors all along, but we've been trained to believe that actually people of color were the aggressors. So we have generations and generations of women, generations and generations of men who have been told, watch out, they're dangerous, watch out, they're dangerous, watch out, they're dangerous, right? And so that tenseness, yes, a big part of it is cultural, but there may be a piece of it that's also epigenetic because of how we've been trained to be scared over centuries, over. And so these are, and the systemic is actually something very different. It supports all those dimensions, but the systemic is rules, regulations, cultures, and practices that uphold that culture. So like I think of systemic racism as a tree and the culture as the soil, right? A tree doesn't live for 600 years without a nurturing soil. Like you have to have a really nurturing soil for a tree to survive that long, right? And so our culture has nourished it. And there also is the seed that was planted, it actually becomes part of the tree. And I would argue that that seed is fear and all the variations of fear.
Wow.
And so I think what's important to say is that when we talk about the reason why the systemic conversations often become the personal conversations is because it can be very overwhelming to think of the systemic. Because when we start thinking about rules and regulations, then you end up talking about the Constitution. And not everyone wants to talk about a conversation of like, well, then we need to change the Constitution because the Constitution was rooted in slavery and everything was right. It ends up being so big that we feel powerless. So we go back to the individual. And in some ways, it's true, like the system won't change unless our culture changes, and the system is also upheld by the culture. So I think it's important for us to go back to the personal conversation as a point, as an opportunity for us to transform the way fear shows up in our bodies, the way pain shows up in our bodies, the way numbness shows up in our bodies. And by all means, Like, we white folk are no more healed. Actually, I would argue in a lot of ways that I think African Americans are a lot more healed than we are. It's just that we've built a system we've set the standard so we can make it look like we're sane, but I don't think we are. I think there's a lot of pain that we also have to heal. It just looks different in white communities than it looks in Black communities.
So,
Can I say
And the
something
organizer,
quick?
oh, go
Is
ahead.
like in our culture, just like I love the way Maggie brought that up and what Rita you just said, and it's because like in our culture, we were taught whatever happens in the house stays in the house. We've been taught to be suppressive. We were taught, okay, like you guys were the enemy as opposed to what you guys were. So that's where communication comes in. That we really need to come together and have a dialogue of these things because of the way we were taught. And it wasn't until maybe like my parents, starting with my parents' generation, my generation, and the next generation, people are now speaking up. They're speaking up to this trauma. And they didn't have the services then like they do now to help with that or to assist with that. So I'm really glad that you brought that up because now is the time. I've heard kids say, I'm not acting like Martin anymore. I'm acting like Malcolm. And they're getting out, standing up and fighting. My parents' generations were protests. Mine are protests and standing up and acting out. Now the next generation, I heard, oh no, we're not taking this. We're standing up for what we believe in. They're protesting too as well. And it's like we want to fight this to change this. And it's not just racism amongst the colors, it's also racism amongst the genders.
Mm.
what's occurring for me out of this is all of that is around protecting my belief system and protecting me inside that belief system. It's all a moat. It's all a wall. It's all protection so that I don't have to deal with all this crap. It's just protecting me and my belief system. And it all works for me and it's all okay. And I don't know what the hell you guys are doing because you're wrong.
And Warren, I don't think it
organizer,
actually
yeah.
works for us, though.
No,
It
it
doesn't
doesn't.
work for us.
You're right,
It
and I'm
works for
wrong, and vice
1%
versa.
at the top. Sorry, sorry, really passionate about that. I think it works for 1% of people at the top, and we actually bought into it. I don't think it works for us.
No, I agree.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have like these depression rates and people on pills and like suicide rates are up. Like everything's up. Like
It's psychosis, really.
You're right.
Yeah.
I mean, the Warren, the organizer, and me said, and Rita, each of you said something that said the organizer in me needs to say something, which is that to shift culture, we need a lot more white people committed to uprooting racism. We do not have a critical mass.
Yeah, I got it.
We need more than we have, and the more we organize ourselves, that's speaking to the white folks, the more we're going to shift the culture around this.
I agree. And protecting my belief system is the big lie because that's the narrowest pinpoint there is.
Yes.
You can't balance a planet system on a pinpoint, but that's what we're doing as individuals.
Yes. So on that note, everyone, this has been rich and powerful, and we have gone to so many different places. I want to thank you for joining us today. And I know we're approaching the top of the hour. So if anyone needs to hop off before we complete, please feel free to do so. I am going to go ahead and just pop around and remind everyone of the magic and power that you offer. Maggie with World Peace Through Awesome Sex, please check out the work that she's doing there. Inez with her wellness practice. Kim's Zen Den, where you can get metaphysical treatment and coaching. Warren, thank you so much for your words and your generosity. I know you're working on a book right now, and we look forward to that coming out. Dr. Rita, I know you're also working on a book, and we look forward to having you back in October. And Ellen, thank you for your work and your practice, and anything that anyone wants to say that we didn't cover about what you do in the world before we wrap up.
I agree with Ellen. It's us old white men. We got a job. We're the perpetrators. We are the primary perpetrators of all this BS. We got to take it down. And I apologize. I mean that. I apologize. It's BS. And we're the primary perpetrators. I'm sorry.
Well, I want to thank all of you guys for your comments, because it did bring up some things that needed to be addressed. And it is, actually, I really love this process, because this is a process that involves the healing and the wellness of our community, and bridging and coming together and bridge something. Like, we need to come together, have dialogues like this continuously, and keep doing this, because it's not just racism amongst the colors, it's racism amongst, men and women, against genders, anyone that they feel is different, which we're not. We're all spirits. We're walking around in this body. That's all we are. So, and with our authentic self, we can accomplish anything and everything. We do not have to stay in that type of space of hatred. We do not. Just because you're different don't mean I can't learn from you. I can learn from you. And I can get along with you. I look at your heart. That's what I look at.
Thank you.
I love that, Inez. And I believe we're all spiritual beings who agreed to have a human experience. And I love the contrast, and that's how we learn and grow. I look at the most difficult people in my lives as my greatest teachers. And I try to see what I can learn from that. And by far, I'm not perfect. I'm so screwed up. But the little things that I'm doing, and I want to talk to the white folks about doing, is when you're out in public, just be mindful. Just be mindful. If someone's angry at you, it's a person of color, just let it go, because it does flow down from generation to generation. And if we are empathetic and we don't tie into that, they're going to be, it creates a shift. It creates a small little change. So right now, that's all I know to do, because this is such a huge thing that's been going on for 400 years. But that's what I'm doing, just little by little.
Thank you. Yes, one step at a time.
And to add on to what Kim said, it's really, and to tie in what Dr. Rita said, it really is all fear. And if we could slow down and say, okay, my body's registering fear. Is that fear real? Like, why do I fear this person? There's something about, in the whole history of humanity, the conversation of us versus them. It's there underlying. And if we can look at what is that fear? What makes them over there and me over here? And is that real? Because the globe is so small now. People are all connected, and that's my world peace through awesome sex. Sex connects everyone on a human level. So it's a grassroots where you can actually do the understanding of people and the connection and intimacy, because all humans are connected. So why, like, looking at the fear and going, is that real? Or is it just something we've been taught? Thank you.
I like what you're saying, Maggie. And I think for white people, silence is violence. I think we need to get out there. We need to have these conversations. That's why I'm so grateful for this platform. And, you know, Dr. Rita and Ellen probably have more to say about that too, because y'all have done the research. And then, of course, Nika and Inez, y'all live it every day. So, but I think the conversation is the start of the dismantling of the fear-based crap that has been generated by the white man, the white European man, whatever, you know, I mean, we're talking religion, we're talking slavery, we're talking government, I could go on. So just the conversation, I can't be silent anymore.
Thank you. Yes. Ellen and Dr. Rita, would you like to share some last minute shares?
What I'd like to add is that I think white women have an important role to play in this work. Wayne, you mentioned like an apology as a white man. There's also a lot of apologies to put as us white women, right? In saying, because we've been the spark of this narrative, in that in our culture, we've been taught that white men were protecting white women. And so it's very easy in everyday repetition of the old, that when we start huffing and puffing and doing the damsels in distress, we reactivate an old narrative and an old. So, and I think, you know, white women know oppression because we know oppression is women. So it's a little bit easier for us to connect with what the experience of oppression is. And so a note to kind of white women, as a white woman who for many years didn't associate with white women, right? Because we also do this stuff about kind of distancing ourselves from people who look like us, like a note to creating sisterhood with other women and really doing the deep healing work that it takes for us to love people who look like us, and not play the damsel in distress card that has done so much damage over the years. Yeah, and just taking on our own healing, as kind of everyone's been saying here, so we can live from really what we're up to and what we love and what we stand for, instead of making every single decision in our life from a place of fear, because that supports the system. And Nika, thank you for the platform. You're amazing.
Yep.
Love being here with you. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that fighting for justice is a learned behavior. And there might be many ways that you got taught not to recognize justice, but we come out of the womb recognizing being able to recognize it, and being able to get rageful and angry enough when we don't get our needs met, or when something is unjust. We notice it at a very young age, and then it gets trained out of us. And so I just want to say that there's that part, right, of you know, picking up the relearning, the unlearning, if you will, and then also orienting your nervous system towards justice, right? I think that the idea that we might feel fear doesn't mean we shouldn't do it anyway.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. All right, everyone out there, thank you for joining us today. This was the ItCast, Real Talk on Healing Historic Trauma, Part 2. The ItCast is our community outreach podcast that aims to increase diversity in conversations on health and sexuality. Through this work, we're creating a world where all people feel loved, honored, and respected. Please visit us on Patreon to support the ItCast and learn more about our work at theitcast.com. Also, subscribe to the YouTube channel and share this work with your community. Let everyone know so that we can continue to impact the world. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Nika. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nika.
It's
Thank you,
amazing.
Nika. Thank you, everyone, for coming.